When my father married a woman who cared more about country club memberships than her own soul, I made a choice. I kept the $52 million my late grandfather left me an absolute secret. It turned out to be the smartest decision I ever made. I watched them flaunt their leased luxury cars and brag about their fake wealth waiting for the inevitable collapse. They treated me like an outsider in my own bloodline, whispering behind my back while spending money they did not earn. Just days later, my father's new wife showed up at my door uninvited with a sleazy lawyer at her side, demanding I hand over what little money they thought I had. They had no idea they were walking straight into a trap that would tear their entire empire apart by midnight. If you have ever been treated like the family disappointment while building a kingdom in the shadows, stay with me. You will want to hear exactly how I burned their perfect image to the ground. The pounding on my apartment door was so violent it rattled the doorframe. I did not even have time to check the security camera before the heavy oak door was shoved open. Valerie barged in her designer heels, clicking aggressively against my hardwood floor. She was my father's new wife, a woman who treated Atlanta high society like a blood sport. Right behind her was a man in a cheap suit carrying a leather briefcase, looking like an ambulance chaser who had just hit the jackpot. Valerie did not bother with a greeting. She did not even wait for an invitation to step further inside. She marched straight to my glass coffee table, her gaze sweeping over my work documents with absolute disdain, and slammed a thick stack of legal papers right on top of my morning notes. "Sign it," she ordered, crossing her arms over her silk blouse. "I am not playing games today, Aaliyah. Your father and I have a major anniversary gala to host tonight, and I need this finalized before the caterers arrive." I looked down at the documents, then back up at her perfectly contoured face. I asked what exactly I was supposed to be signing at 8 in the morning on a Friday. Her lawyer stepped forward, clearing his throat with a self-important smirk. "It is a standard relinquishment of assets," he explained. "You are transferring the management of the small trust fund your grandfather left you over to your father. It is entirely legal and highly recommended for family wealth consolidation." I felt a laugh building in my chest, but I kept my face entirely blank. I asked Valerie why my father needed my tiny trust fund consolidated into his personal accounts right now. Valerie rolled her eyes, scoffing loudly. "Because Carlton needs the liquid cash to secure a board seat for Connor," she snapped. "Sydney's husband needs that position to elevate our family status. Sydney is the perfect daughter because she married a man who actually understands how the world works. Connor is a top-tier investment director. He is white, he is wealthy, and he opens doors your father needs open to keep his business relevant in this modern market. We have an image of black excellence to maintain in this city, and we cannot afford to look weak in front of the elite investors tonight. You, on the other hand, do absolutely nothing to contribute to this family's prestige." She paced across my living room, looking around my understated apartment with pure disgust. "Look at you, Aaliyah. You are 32 years old and still single. You refuse to get an advanced business degree. You refuse to marry a successful surgeon like your perfect stepsister did. Instead, you run some pathetic crisis management firm. You are essentially a glorified maid for scandals, cleaning up the messes of disgraced politicians and messy celebrities. You bring zero value to the Dubois family name. Connor is actually going to do something meaningful with that money. Let the real men handle the high-level finances." The audacity of her words hung in the air. She was standing in a penthouse I owned outright, demanding I hand over a decoy trust fund to feed the ambitions of an arrogant white savior who treated our family like his personal charity project. My grandfather Elijah built his real estate empire from the ground up, fighting through decades of systemic barriers. He knew exactly how greedy Valerie was and how weak my father Carlton had become under her superficial influence. Elijah saw right through their country club facades and fake wealth. That was why the trust fund she was currently pointing at held exactly $100,000, while the $52 million Elijah actually left me was completely hidden. It was secured in untouchable offshore accounts under my corporate entity, far away from their greedy hands. I looked at the legal documents sitting on my table. They were poorly drafted, desperate, and reeked of impending bankruptcy. My father was drowning in massive debt, and Valerie was trying to scavenge my crumbs to buy her son-in-law a seat at a table they could no longer afford. I picked up the stack of papers. Valerie smiled, assuming she had won, extending a gold pen toward me. I did not take the pen. Instead, I carefully folded the documents in half and handed them back to her lawyer. I am not signing this here. Here, I said, my voice steady and cold. Valerie's smile vanished instantly. What do you mean you are not signing? She demanded, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. You will sign it right now, or your father will publicly disown you tonight in front of the entire city. I stood up, looking down at her. That sounds like a wonderful plan, I replied calmly. I will bring these documents to the anniversary gala tonight. Let my father ask me for my money in public. Let him stand in front of all his wealthy friends and beg his disappointing daughter for a handout. If he wants it that badly, he can ask me himself. Valerie turned bright red, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to find a suitable comeback. Fine, she finally hissed, snatching the papers from her lawyer. Be difficult and see where it gets you. But when you show up tonight, you better have a pen ready, or you are completely dead to this family. She spun around and stormed out of my apartment, her lawyer scurrying out right behind her. The heavy door clicked shut, leaving me in total silence. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the beautiful Atlanta skyline. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed my attorney. Harrison answered on the very first ring. I did not bother saying hello. Valerie just left my apartment, I told him. She brought the relinquishment papers. They are desperate enough to force my hand at the gala tonight. I heard Harrison chuckle softly on the other end of the line. I took a deep breath, feeling the power shift entirely into my hands. Initiate Project Alpha, I instructed him, my voice turning to absolute ice. Gather the federal filings and the foreclosure deeds. We are burning the empire down tonight. The valet at my father's Buckhead mansion barely had time to open my car door before the heavy bass of a live jazz band vibrated through the driveway. I stepped out into the humid Atlanta evening, smoothing the fabric of my custom-tailored ivory gown. Walking through the massive mahogany front doors felt like stepping onto a battlefield disguised as a high society gala. The ballroom was a sea of designer tuxedos and couture dresses, a curated display of black excellence meant to impress the dozens of wealthy white investors Carlton had invited. I did not even make it to the champagne tower before a shadow blocked my path. Sydney stood there wearing a shimmering emerald dress paid for by my father's dwindling credit lines, holding a glass of dark Pinot Noir. Her lips curled into a vicious smirk just a second before she violently flicked her wrist. The crimson liquid splashed directly across my ivory bodice, soaking into the silk. "Oops, my bad!" Sydney announced, her voice deliberately loud enough to turn heads at the neighboring tables. "I completely forgot you were standing there, Aaliyah. Though honestly, I am doing you a favor. That dress looks like something you bought off a clearance rack. It is a shame you do not have a rich husband to buy you a replacement. You are going to look so out of place in the family photos tonight." I looked down at the ruined silk, then back up at her perfectly smug face. Instead, I held her gaze with absolute calm. "You always were messy, Sydney," I replied, keeping my tone even. "But I suppose spilling wine is the only thing you actually know how to do yourself, since you hire people to do literally everything else in your life." Before Sydney could unleash her next insult, heavy footsteps approached us. My father Carlton pushed his way through the crowd of onlookers, his face twisted in absolute fury. He did not look at Sydney holding the empty wine glass. He looked directly at my stained dress and scowled. "What is wrong with you, Aaliyah?" he hissed, grabbing my arm and pulling me a few steps away from his elite guests. "You have been in this house for 2 minutes, and you are already causing a humiliating scene. Look around you. The most powerful investors in the state are watching us. I have mayors, judges, and Connor's private equity partners in this room, and you show up looking like a complete disaster." "She threw her drink on me," I pointed out, refusing to call him Dad. "Your stepdaughter deliberately ruined my dress." "It does not matter what she did," he fired back, his voice dripping with venom. "You should have moved out of the way. You have always been the problem in this family. Ever since your biological mother passed away, you have done nothing but bring difficult, stubborn energy into my home. Valerie and Sydney have bent over backward to include you, but you always find a way to play the victim and embarrass me." The sheer audacity of his words hit me, but I refused to let the hurt show on my face. He was actually blaming me for standing in the trajectory of Sydney's thrown glass. He was using the death of my mother, the woman who actually funded his first business venture, to justify treating me like the family scapegoat. It was the same toxic dynamic I had endured my entire life. Just as I was about to respond, a heavy hand clamped down firmly on my shoulder. I turned my head to see Connor Sidney's husband standing uncomfortably close. He was wearing a tailored navy suit and an arrogant smile that perfectly encapsulated his entire personality. As the only white man currently standing in our immediate circle, he carried an air of unearned superiority, acting as if he owned the very floor we were standing on. Connor squeezed my shoulder in a patronizing grip, giving me a look of fake pity. "Listen, kiddo," Connor said, his voice lowering into a condescending whisper. "We all know you are struggling with that little boutique public relations firm of yours. It is cute that you want to be an independent boss lady, but let us be realistic here. You are playing out of your league. Atlanta business is cutthroat, and you do not have the connections or the capital to survive. Just sign the trust relinquishment documents Valerie brought you this morning. If you hand over the management of your grandfather's money to me, I will personally make sure you get a generous monthly stipend. You will never have to worry about rent again. Let the men handle the high-level finances. You go buy yourself a new dress and stop stressing your father out." The casual misogyny and subtle racism laced into his words made my blood run cold. He was looking at me, a self-made 32-year-old crisis management CEO, as if I were a clueless child who needed his white savior complex to survive. He genuinely believed that because he married into a wealthy black family, he had the right to dictate my financial future. I slowly reached up and removed his hand from my shoulder, brushing off my skin, as if he had left a layer of grime on my collarbone. "I do not need a stipend from a man who uses his father-in-law's country club membership to get dinner reservations," I replied, my voice completely flat. "And I definitely do not take financial advice from someone who marries for money." Connor's arrogant smile vanished, his face flushing a deep, angry red. Sydney gasped, stepping forward to defend her husband, but Carlton threw his hand up to silence her. He glared at me with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. "If you want to act like an ungrateful enemy of this family, Aaliyah, then I will treat you like one," he growled. Carlton turned his back on me and marched directly toward the center of the grand ballroom. He signaled the live band to stop playing. The jazz music faded into a tense, heavy silence. Carlton grabbed a crystal champagne glass from a passing waiter and clinked it loudly with a silver spoon. The sharp ringing echoed across the vaulted ceiling, drawing every eye in the room. "It is time to address a family disappointment," he announced, his voice booming through the ballroom as he turned to glare directly at me. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute as 200 of Atlanta's elite socialites turned their eyes toward me. Carlton stood under the crystal chandelier, holding his champagne glass like a weapon. He looked out at the politicians and real estate moguls, projecting the image of a heartbroken but dignified patriarch. I watched his chest heave as he prepared to deliver the performance of a lifetime. "For years, I have tried to guide my eldest daughter back to the path of success." Carlton projected, his voice echoing off the marble pillars. "My wife Valerie and my stepdaughter Sydney welcomed her with open arms. We offered her positions in my company. We tried to introduce her to high society. But instead of embracing the Dubois family legacy, Aaliyah has chosen to rebel at every turn. She runs a chaotic public relations firm, catering to disgraced politicians. She brings nothing but shame to our good name." The wealthy guests began to whisper. I could feel their judgmental stares burning into my skin, but I kept my spine straight and my chin high. Valerie stood nearby, linking her arm tightly through Sydney's. They both wore identical expressions of malicious glee, waiting for me to break. Carlton took a dramatic pause, letting the heavy atmosphere settle over the room. He pointed a finger directly at my face. "Tonight, I am giving you one final chance to prove you belong in this family. Aaliyah," he declared. "Your grandfather left a small trust fund in your name before his mind slipped. You are incapable of managing those assets. Your brother-in-law Connor is a highly respected investment director. He has graciously offered to take over the financial management of that trust so the money can secure his seat on the Regional Commerce Board. This will elevate our entire family. Connor stepped out from the crowd, moving to stand right beside my father. He smoothed the lapels of his tailored suit, giving the audience a practiced, humble nod. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the exact same legal relinquishment document Valerie had thrown on my coffee table that morning. He unfolded the papers and held them out toward me. Then he retrieved a heavy gold fountain pen from his jacket. "We just want what is best for you," Aaliyah Connor said, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "You are drowning in debt with that little business of yours. Sign over the trust management to me right now. In exchange, I will personally guarantee you a generous monthly allowance. You will not have to struggle anymore. You can finally step back and let the adults handle the heavy lifting." The audacity of this white man, standing in my father's house, trying to publicly strip me of my inheritance, was staggering. The crowd murmured their approval. I heard a woman behind me whisper that I should be grateful for such a forgiving family. Carlton crossed his arms over his chest, puffing himself up with pride. "If you refuse to sign that document tonight, you are no longer my daughter," Carlton threatened, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "I will officially disown you right here in front of everyone. I will make sure every client in this city knows your firm is a joke. You will be ruined." I looked at Carlton. Then I looked at Connor. I did not shrink away. I did not cry. I took a slow, deliberate step forward until I was standing dead center in the spotlight. My voice was calm, but it cut through the room like a razor blade. "You love playing the generous patriarch, Carlton," I said, ensuring every guest in the room could hear me clearly. "But you and I both know you only use money as a leash to control the people around you. You stand up here talking about the Dubois family legacy, but you are nothing but a tyrant obsessed with maintaining a fake image." Carlton's eyes widened in shock. Valerie stepped forward, opening her mouth to scream, but my voice overpowered hers. "Do not talk to me about financial responsibility." I continued, taking another step toward the men. "I remember exactly how generous you are. When I was 19 years old, you completely cut off my college tuition. You left me to face eviction in the middle of my sophomore year, simply because I refused to pledge the legacy. Sorority," Valerie demanded I join. "You tried to starve me into submission because I would not become a clone of your new wife." The whispers in the crowd shifted. Several people exchanged uncomfortable glances. Sydney tried to scoff, but the sound died in her throat. "You thought cutting me off would ruin me," I said, staring directly into Carlton's panicking eyes. "But it was the best thing you ever did. It forced me to build my crisis management firm from nothing. I swept floors, I worked night shifts, and I built a profitable empire while you were busy buying expensive tables at elite country club dinners you could barely afford. I do not need a monthly allowance from a man who married into this family just to elevate his own fragile ego and pretend he is some kind of corporate savior." I turned my attention back to Connor. His fake, sympathetic smile had completely vanished, replaced by a tight, nervous frown. He held the gold pen out a little further, as if the metal object could somehow protect him from my words. "Just sign the paper," Connor muttered under his breath, his jaw clenched tight. "Stop making a complete fool of yourself." I slowly reached out my hand. The grand ballroom fell dead silent. Carlton let out a heavy sigh of relief, thinking he had finally broken my spirit. Valerie smirked, victorious. I took the heavy gold fountain pen from Connor's trembling fingers. I looked down at the legal document detailing the transfer of my grandfather's trust. I held the pen over the signature line for a long, tense moment. Then I deliberately opened my hand, letting the expensive gold pen clatter loudly onto the polished hardwood floor. It rolled away, disappearing under a nearby catering table. "I am not signing this," I announced, my voice ringing with absolute finality. I reached into my silk designer clutch. I bypassed my phone and my keys, wrapping my fingers around a thick red file folder I had prepared earlier that afternoon. I pulled the heavy folder out and stepped directly into Connor's personal space. Before he could take a step back, I slammed the red folder squarely into his chest. The physical impact forced his arms up to grab it instinctively, preventing the documents from spilling across the floor. "I am not signing," I repeated, staring straight into his terrified blue eyes. "Because I do not hand over family assets to a man who is actively being investigated by the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The heavy red folder hit Connor's chest with a loud thud, knocking the breath out of him. He stumbled backward, his polished designer shoes scraping awkwardly against the marble floor. The folder burst open, slipping from his manicured hands and scattering dozens of high-gloss financial documents across the ground. The entire ballroom gasped in unison. 200 elite guests leaned forward, their champagne flutes frozen in midair. Connor stared down at the papers, his face draining of all color until he looked like a ghost. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic stammering sound came out. He looked around wildly, trying to make eye contact with his wealthy white investment partners, who were suddenly taking very deliberate steps away from him. "What is this?" He finally choked out, his voice pitching an octave higher than normal. "This is a complete fabrication. I have never seen these documents in my life." "You are insane, Alia. You are literally insane." I stepped forward, closing the distance between us, my heels clicking sharply against the floor. "You know exactly what those documents are, Connor," I said, projecting my voice so every single investor in the room could hear me perfectly. "My crisis management firm does not just handle messy celebrities. We handle corporate disasters. And last Tuesday, your senior partners quietly retained my agency to draft a media containment strategy. They needed a narrative to explain why $5 million had suddenly vanished from the offshore accounts you personally manage. They wanted me to spin a story about market volatility and external hacking. But the numbers told the exact truth about your dirty little habits." The silence in the room shattered. Frantic whispers erupted among the crowd. Mayors and judges exchanged horrified looks, while the board members Carlton had so desperately tried to impress began pulling out their phones to text their own legal teams. Connor shook his head violently, his perfect savior facade crumbling into pure panic. "You signed a non-disclosure agreement," he hissed through his teeth, stepping toward me with a desperate, threatening glare. "You cannot legally talk about client acquisition." I smiled, an ice-cold smile that made him freeze in his tracks. "I never signed anything, Connor," I replied evenly. "I rejected the contract the moment I saw your name on the internal audit report. I do not do cleanup for arrogant men who steal from their own investors to fund their country club lifestyles. You embezzled $5 million to cover the massive crypto losses you hid from your board." I pointed down at the papers scattered around his expensive shoes. "Those are the wire transfer records detailing exactly how you moved the funds through dummy shell companies in the Cayman Islands. You are not a financial genius bringing salvation to a black family. You are a common thief running a glorified Ponzi scheme, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation has already subpoenaed those exact same bank records. You are not getting a seat on the Regional Commerce Board. You are getting a federal indictment." Sydney let out an ear-piercing shriek that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. She stomped across the floor, her emerald dress swishing violently as she stepped right over the damning evidence. She shoved herself between Connor and me, her eyes wild with rage. "Shut up, you jealous liar," Sydney screamed, pointing a trembling finger right in my face. "You are making all of this up just to ruin my perfect marriage. You have always hated me because I found a successful man who actually loves me while you sit alone in your empty apartment. You cannot stand the fact that I am happy, and you are nothing but a miserable failure." Before I could respond to her delusional outburst, Valerie charged through the crowd like a raging bull. Her carefully crafted high society elegance evaporated completely. She lunged at me, her face twisted into a mask of pure venom. The sharp crack of her hand slapping across my left cheek echoed like a gunshot through the silent ballroom. My head snapped to the side from the sheer force of the blow. The guests gasped aloud, stepping back in shock at the sudden physical violence. Valerie stood over me, her chest heaving as she pointed a shaking finger at my face. "You bitter little spinster," Valerie screeched, her voice raw and hateful. "You come into this house and try to destroy our prestige just because no man will ever look at you. You are a disgrace to the Dubois name, and you will pay for trying to ruin my daughter's future. You have been plotting this out of pure spite because you are empty inside. You are nothing but a miserable mistake that Carlton should have cut off decades ago. I did not stumble. I did not raise my hand to defend myself, and I absolutely did not cry. I slowly turned my head back to face Valerie. My cheek burned with a fierce heat, but my expression remained completely unaffected. I calmly reached up and wiped a small smudge of Valerie's expensive foundation off my jawline. I looked past the screaming woman and past my hysterical stepsister, locking my eyes directly onto my father. Carlton looked like a man who had just watched his entire universe collapse into ash. His breathing was ragged, his hands gripping the edge of a nearby catering table just to keep himself standing. The elite image he had sacrificed my entire childhood to build was dead on the floor right next to Connor's fake financial statements. The investors he had desperately tried to court were already walking toward the coat check, clearly disgusted by the spectacle. Carlton's eyes met mine, and they were filled with a hatred so deep it was almost tangible. He pushed himself off the table, his face purple with rage. "Security!" Carlton screamed, his voice cracking as he pointed a shaking hand at the front entrance. "Get the guards in here right now! Throw this piece of trash out of my house immediately! I want her gone!" I stood my ground, surrounded by the wreckage of their fake perfection. I let a slow, chilling smile spread across my face as I looked at the man who had tormented me for 32 years. "You cannot throw me out of your house, Carlton," I said, my voice ringing crystal clear over the chaotic murmurs of the ballroom, "because it is not yours." Carlton froze completely. The fiery rage that had just twisted his face evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, pale mask of terror. His mouth hung open slightly, but no words came out. His hands dropped from the table, falling uselessly to his sides. Valerie, however, did not possess the same self-awareness. She let out a harsh, grating laugh that pierced the heavy silence of the ballroom. She looked around at the elite guests, gesturing toward me with a manic wave. "She has completely lost her mind," Valerie announced, her voice shrill and desperate, trying to rally the confused onlookers. "Look at her standing there spewing absolute nonsense just to ruin a beautiful evening. Carlton owns this estate free and clear. It has been the crown jewel in his portfolio for over a decade. She is just a bitter, delusional girl trying to embarrass us because her own life is an utter failure. Someone call the psychiatric ward and have her committed. Do not listen to a single word she says." I did not even look at Valerie. She was nothing but background noise to the actual destruction taking place. I kept my eyes locked on my father, watching him slowly suffocate under the weight of his own financial secrets. I stepped away from him and walked purposefully toward the raised platform where the live jazz band had been playing earlier. The musicians had abandoned their instruments, leaving a single silver microphone standing dead center on the stage. I climbed the short wooden steps, my heels echoing sharply against the platform. I grabbed the microphone, pulling it firmly from the stand. The feedback whined for a brief second before settling into a crisp hum. I looked out over the sea of wealthy investors, prominent politicians, and high society socialites who had spent the entire evening sipping expensive champagne while judging my every move. "Valerie thinks I am delusional." I spoke into the microphone, my voice booming powerfully through the state-of-the-art sound system. "She thinks my father is a titan of industry, sitting comfortably on a mountain of generational wealth. But Valerie does not look at the accounting ledgers. She only looks at the black credit card limits Carlton provides her. If she had bothered to look at the public property records filed down at the Fulton County Courthouse, she would know that Carlton Dubois has not owned this Buckhead mansion for exactly 34 days. Shocked murmurs erupted across the ballroom. People began whispering frantically to each other, leaning in to share the scandalous gossip. Carlton finally found his voice, taking a weak, desperate step forward. "Aaliyah, please," he croaked, holding up the trembling hand, his confident posture completely shattered. "Do not do this right now. This is private family business. We can fix this together. Keep this between us." "You wanted to make my financial status a public spectacle." Carlton, I replied directly into the microphone, refusing to show him an ounce of mercy. You wanted to stand on a stage and humiliate me in front of 200 people to make yourself look like a generous king dealing with a pathetic peasant. So we are going to do this in public exactly how you wanted. We are going to talk about the brutal reality of your finances right here and right now. I paced across the stage looking down at the horrified faces of his elite friends. For the last 5 years, my father has been bleeding his logistics company dry, I announced, projecting every word with absolute clarity. He took out a second mortgage on this estate just to cover his basic corporate payroll. Then he took out a third mortgage to fund Sydney's lavish destination wedding, so he could pretend he was wealthy enough to marry into Connor's elite investment circles. He leveraged every single asset he had left just to keep up appearances and buy expensive cars he could not afford. Sydney gasped loudly, covering her mouth with both hands as she looked at Connor. Connor was still too paralyzed by his own impending federal indictment to even process what I was saying. He just stared at the floor, breathing heavily in complete silence. You love to preach about black excellence, Carlton. I continued, staring him down from the stage. You love to stand at exclusive country club dinners and boast about building a pristine legacy. You looked down on me because I refused to marry for money, and because I built a firm from the ground up working 18-hour days. You called my honest, grueling work an embarrassment to the Dubois name. But what is truly embarrassing is a man who borrows millions of dollars he cannot repay just to buy fake friends. You are drowning in debt, Carlton. You are hollow. The bank issued the final default notice 6 months ago, I explained, watching the horror wash over Valerie's face as she finally began to understand the basic math of her situation. They gave you multiple chances to restructure your loans, but you ignored their calls because acknowledging the debt would mean admitting you were a complete failure. So the bank quietly foreclosed on this entire estate last month. They put it up for a private commercial auction to avoid a messy public scandal. You have been living in a foreclosed property illegally for 4 weeks, hoping a magical bailout would save you. Valerie's entire body began to shake uncontrollably. The terrifying reality of the situation finally pierced through her thick layer of denial and Botox. She whipped her head around to face Carlton. Her eyes were wide and frantic like a trapped animal realizing the cage was locked tight. "Tell me she is lying!" Carlton, Valerie screamed, grabbing his tuxedo jacket and shaking him violently. "Tell me you did not lose this house. You told me you were a multimillionaire. You told me we had unlimited generational wealth. What about my monthly allowance? What about the winter ski trip to Aspen?" Carlton could not even look at her. He stared at the polished marble floor, his shoulders slumped in absolute defeat. The powerful, intimidating patriarch had vanished, leaving behind a pathetic, broken old man who had lost everything. Valerie realized the agonizing truth in his silence. She shoved him backward with a violent, piercing shriek that made the guests flinch. "You lied to me!" Valerie shrieked, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. "You let me stand here and humiliate myself defending a broke man. If the bank foreclosed on this house, then who owns it now? Who bought the house? Carlton." Carlton shook his head slowly, genuine tears brimming in his eyes for the first time in his life. "I do not know," he whispered brokenly. "The commercial auction was completely anonymous. I do not know who the buyer was." Right at that exact moment, the massive double doors at the main entrance of the ballroom swung open with a resounding, deafening crash. The heavy oak doors slammed against the freshly painted walls, making several wealthy guests jump back in pure surprise. A tall man wearing a razor-sharp charcoal suit strode purposefully into the ballroom, bypassing the confused security guards. It was Harrison, my ruthless corporate attorney. He carried a sleek leather briefcase and walked with the absolute confidence of a man holding all the winning cards. Harrison marched directly through the parted crowd of stunned guests, stopping right next to the stage where I stood. He looked at Valerie, then at Carlton, a predatory smile playing on his lips. "She did," Harrison announced, his voice cutting through the silent room like a razor-sharp blade, leaving absolutely no room for any doubt. The entire ballroom inhaled sharply as the words echoed off the walls. Harrison did not even glance at the stunned guests. He walked straight up to Valerie's sleazy attorney, hovering near the catering tables. Harrison unclasped his briefcase, pulling out a crisp stack of legal documents. He shoved the official deed directly against the other lawyer's chest. "Read it carefully," Harrison commanded, his voice echoing through the silent room. "Check the county seals and transfer signatures. You are standing on private property owned exclusively by Aelia Dubois and her corporate holding firm." The sleazy lawyer scrambled to adjust his glasses, his hands shaking violently. He scanned the legal jargon, his eyes darting frantically across the page. Valerie marched over, grabbing his shoulder and digging her manicured nails into his cheap suit. "Tell me this is a forgery," Valerie hissed, trembling with desperate rage. "Tell me she faked this right now." The lawyer slowly lowered the papers and swallowed hard. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking sick. "It is real, Valerie," he whispered, taking a deliberate step away from her. "The bank transfer is verified, and this county clerk certified the sale yesterday. She owns the entire estate." Carlton let out a choked, agonizing gasp. The powerful, imposing patriarch who had spent my entire life making me feel incredibly small was now literally shrinking before my eyes. He looked up at me with absolute terror and profound confusion. "You bought my house," Carlton stammered, his voice cracking into a pathetic whimper. "How could you possibly afford to buy my house out from under me?" "I am a crisis management CEO, Carlton," I replied, keeping my tone dangerously calm. "My entire career is built on anticipating disasters before they happen. I saw your financial collapse coming months ago." Before Carlton could process the reality that his despised daughter was now his legal landlord, a piercing sound shattered the heavy atmosphere. Police sirens echoed from the circular driveway outside. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the massive stained glass windows, casting eerie rotating shadows across the horrified faces of the elite guests. The high society crowd erupted into panic. Politicians grabbed their coats, and wealthy real estate moguls began shoving their way toward the side exits, desperate to avoid whatever scandal was unfolding. The heavy double doors of the mansion were violently thrown open for the second time that night. A dozen federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers with the FBI logo stormed into the grand foyer. They completely ignored the lavish decorations and the screaming socialites, moving with swift, terrifying precision to form a perimeter around the main dance floor. A stern-faced lead agent stepped forward, holding up a gold badge. "Nobody leave the room," the agent ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We are executing a federal arrest warrant for Connor Wright." Connor whipped his head around his complex, instantly vanishing. He looked at the federal agents closing in on him, and pure survival instinct took over. He spun on his heel and tried to sprint toward the kitchen door, but Sydney was faster. She lunged forward, grabbing the back of his suit jacket with both hands, yanking him backward with unexpected strength. "Where are you going?" Sydney screamed, her voice cracking with raw hysteria. "Tell me where my money is, Connor. You promised me we were secure. You promised me the offshore accounts were untouchable." Connor stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the stage. He ripped his jacket out of her hands, shoving her away with a look of absolute revulsion. He was no longer the charming white investment director, pretending to uplift a wealthy black family. His true colors finally bled through the cracks of his fake polished persona. "Get your hands off me!" Connor snarled, his face contorting into a mask of elitist disgust. "There is no money left, Sydney. It is all gone. I lost it trying to cover the massive holes your incompetent father blew in his own portfolio." Connor pointed a shaking finger at Carlton, who was still frozen in shock. "Do you think I actually wanted to manage this sinking ship?" Connor shouted, his voice echoing through the horrified ballroom. "Your father's ghetto business practices dragged me down. He runs his corporate logistics company, like a street corner hustle, borrowing from loan sharks just to buy you expensive dresses. I moved my investors' money to keep the feds off his trail, and now I am taking the fall for this pathetic excuse of a family." Sydney gasped, stumbling backward as if struck. The racist venom in his words hung thickly in the air, stripping away every ounce of prestige Carlton had desperately tried to buy through their marriage. Before Connor could spew another insult, two federal agents tackled him from behind. They slammed him face first onto the polished marble floor, pulling his arms aggressively behind his back. The sharp click of handcuffs echoed loudly, silencing the room once again. Connor thrashed, screaming for his lawyers, but the agents dragged him to his feet and marched him toward the front doors. Valerie watched her pristine high society world burning to ashes. She spun around and charged at Carlton, grabbing the lapels of his tuxedo. "Do something!" Valerie shrieked, her voice echoing with absolute desperation. "Call your connections and fix this right now. Use your offshore accounts to post his bail. Call the governor. Call the judges you play golf with. You are the patriarch of this family, so act like it and save us." Carlton stared at her with dead, empty eyes. The man who had spent his life obsessing over power and public image slowly collapsed. His knees gave out and he fell onto the marble floor, landing right in the middle of the spilled wine and the scattered fraudulent bank statements. He looked up at his frantic wife, his face streaked with tears of ultimate defeat. "I cannot fix anything." Valerie Carlton sobbed, his voice breaking into a pathetic hollow wheeze. "I do not have any offshore accounts. I do not have any political favors left to pull. The bank took the cars, the investors pulled their funding, and now they took the house. I do not have anything left." The ballroom was dead silent, save for the sound of my father's miserable weeping. I stood on the edge of the stage, looking down at the broken man who had tormented me, my entire existence, and the greedy stepmother who tried to steal my future. I smiled, a slow, triumphant smile that chilled the room. "But I do," I said. Harrison stood silently at the edge of the dance floor, his posture radiating absolute authority. Valerie spun around so fast her diamond necklace wildly whipped against her collarbone. She stared at my attorney and then turned her frantic, manic eyes toward me. Her perfectly contoured face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly disbelief. "There is absolutely no way!" Valerie shrieked, her voice scraping against the walls of the grand ballroom. "How could you possibly afford a $6 million estate? You run a pathetic little public relations firm fixing scandals for C-list celebrities. You do not have that kind of capital. You must have taken out predatory loans or committed mortgage fraud just to embarrass us tonight." "I did not commit fraud, Valerie," I replied, my voice deadly calm as I stepped down from the raised platform. "I bought this sprawling estate entirely in cash early yesterday morning." Carlton stared at me, his chest heaving as he struggled to process the devastating reality. He looked like a man drowning in quicksand, unable to find a single branch to pull himself out. "Where did you get $6 million in cash?" Carlton wheezed, rubbing his trembling hands over his face. "That is impossible, Aaliyah. You have no support, you have no husband. You refuse to integrate into the high society networks I built for you." I walked slowly across the marble floor, stopping just a few feet away from his broken figure. "I got it from the exact same place you tried to steal from this morning, Carlton," I explained, watching the realization slowly dawn in his eyes. "I got it from Grandpa Elijah." Valerie's jaw dropped open. She pointed a shaking finger at me. "You are lying!" she screamed. "Elijah left you a tiny trust fund. It only had $100,000 in it. My lawyer pulled the files himself. Carlton needed that money to secure Connor's board seat." I let out a dark, humorless laugh that echoed through the silent room. "You really think the man who built a real estate empire from the ground up during the civil rights movement would only leave behind $100,000? I asked mockingly. "That tiny trust fund you were so desperate to steal was nothing but a decoy. It was bait to keep your greedy hands busy while the real money was moved safely out of your reach." The ballroom was so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the abandoned champagne glasses. "Grandpa Elijah did not just leave me a small inheritance," I announced, projecting my voice so every single elite guest remaining in the room could hear the absolute truth. "He liquidated his entire commercial portfolio before he passed away. He moved every single penny into untouchable, untraceable offshore accounts under my corporate holding firm. Grandpa Elijah left me $52 million in pure liquid assets." The collective gasp from the wealthy socialites was deafening. It was a shockwave that completely obliterated the carefully crafted facade my father had spent decades building. Sydney, who had been crying on the floor after watching Connor get dragged away by federal agents, suddenly scrambled to her feet. $52 million. Sydney choked out her tear-streaked face, turning green with sudden extreme envy. Her voice cracked as she realized her own husband was going to federal prison while I was holding a massive fortune. "That is not fair," Sydney wailed, stomping her high heel against the marble floor. "That is family money, Aaliyah. It belongs to all of us. We deserve that money to maintain our status. It belongs to whoever Elijah deemed worthy." I snapped back, silencing her instantly. "And he knew exactly what you people were." Grandpa Elijah sat back and watched this family rot from the inside out. "He saw you, Valerie. He knew you were nothing but a relentless gold digger who married his son just to fund your daughter's luxury shopping sprees. He watched you drain the family accounts to buy designer bags while pretending to be Atlanta royalty. He knew you cared more about expensive gala dinners and matching custom outfits than you ever cared about genuine family bonds. You saw my father as an ATM machine, and when that machine ran dry, you tried to steal my future to cover your tracks." I turned my piercing gaze back to my father, who was practically shrinking into the floorboards. "And he saw you, Carlton." I continued my words, striking him like physical blows. "He watched you become a weak, pathetic man obsessed with country club status and fake prestige. He watched you beg white investment directors like Connor for validation because you hated yourself and your own origins. Grandpa Elijah trusted me with his empire because I was the only one in this entire bloodline who actually mirrored his brilliant work ethic. I built my crisis management company, working 18-hour days without ever begging you for a handout. I never compromised my integrity to fit into your superficial black excellence facade. He knew I would protect the wealth rather than blow it on fake friends and failing logistics companies." Valerie completely lost what was left of her mind. The polished high society matriarch vanished, replaced by a feral, greedy scavenger watching her massive payday slip away. She lunged toward her lawyer, grabbing him roughly by the lapels of his cheap suit. "Sue her," Valerie shrieked, spit flying from her lips as she violently shook the terrified man. "File a massive lawsuit right now." She manipulated a dying man. Elijah had severe dementia in his final months. He did not know what he was doing when he signed those transfers. She committed elder abuse and wire fraud to steal $52 million from her own father. "I am going to drag you through federal court, Aaliyah. I will take every penny you have and leave you rotting in a prison cell." The sleazy lawyer tried to pry Valerie's hands off his jacket, looking frantically toward the exits. Before he could even stutter out a reply, Harrison stepped smoothly into the center of the confrontation. My brilliant corporate attorney held up a sleek silver tablet screen facing the furious stepmother. Harrison tapped the glass surface with one perfectly manicured finger, pulling up a high-definition video file. "I strongly suggest you watch this," Harrison said, his voice deadly and smooth, "before you decide to file that ridiculous motion." Harrison did not wait for Valerie to formulate another screeching threat. He turned his back on her, completely dismissing her existence, and walked toward the audiovisual console behind the catering tables. He plugged a cable into his sleek silver tablet. Instantly, the enormous velvet curtains at the back of the grand ballroom automatically parted. A massive projector screen descended from the vaulted ceiling, whirring softly. The elite guests shifted uncomfortably, their eyes glued to the blinding white light flickering to life across the screen. Carlton let out a pathetic whimpering sound, recognizing the customized digital watermark of his father's personal legal firm flashing across the display. The screen crackled before resolving into a crystal-clear high-definition video. There, sitting behind his massive oak desk, was Grandpa Elijah. He did not look like a frail old man suffering from dementia. He wore a sharp-tailored three-piece suit. His posture was absolute granite, and his eyes burned with fierce, unyielding intensity. To prove his complete mental clarity, Elijah held up a copy of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. The date printed across the front page was exactly 3 days before his sudden passing. He set the newspaper down, folding his hands together, and stared directly into the camera lens, as if he could see straight into Carlton's miserable soul. If this video is playing right now, it means two things. Elijah began, his deep baritone voice rumbling through the surround sound speakers. First, it means I am dead. Second, it means my pathetic excuse for a son has finally pushed my brilliant granddaughter too far. I recorded this message because I knew exactly what would happen the moment my heart stopped beating. I knew the scavengers would start circling the estate, looking for whatever scraps they could tear away from the true heir. The camera angle widened slightly, capturing Elijah's cold, humorless smile. I am talking to you, Valerie, Elijah announced, his voice echoing with pure contempt. I know you are standing in that ballroom right now, plotting how to hire the sleaziest lawyers in Atlanta to contest my will. You thought I was just some senile old fool you could manipulate with fake smiles. I saw you counting my assets the day you married Carlton. You are nothing but a bottom-feeding gold digger who married a weak man to fund your desperate obsession with high society. You only care about showing off for people who despise you. You will not get a single dime of my money, Valerie. Valerie stood frozen in the middle of the ballroom, her face drained of all blood. She looked around at the wealthy socialites who were now openly staring at her with blatant, unapologetic disgust. She tried to open her mouth to defend herself, but no sound came out. Elijah's piercing gaze shifted to the next target. And Carlton, my massive disappointment of a son. Elijah continued, dropping to a lethal calm level. You spent your entire life obsessed with looking like a titan of industry. You threw lavish parties to impress investors who mock you behind your back. But we both know the brutal, ugly truth about how you built your logistics company, Carlton. We both know you are nothing but a fraud who built a house of cards on the grave of a better woman. Carlton collapsed forward onto his hands and knees, pressing his forehead against the cold marble floor, clamping his hands over his ears, desperately trying to block out the booming voice of his dead father, but the speakers were relentless. 32 years ago, Carlton did not secure a brilliant business loan to start his logistics firm, Elijah declared, striking the desk with his fist. He stole the startup capital from Aelia's biological mother. My brilliant late daughter-in-law worked 3 jobs to save that money for her own future. When she passed away, Carlton did not put that money into a trust for his infant daughter. He drained her accounts and used her life savings to fund his own selfish ambitions. He stole from a grieving child just to buy his way into the country club. The massive ballroom erupted into horrified gasps as the terrible secret was finally exposed. I stood perfectly still, letting the undeniable truth wash over the stunned crowd. Carlton had always called me a burden, claiming he sacrificed everything to raise me. But in reality, my mother's death had financed his entire fake empire. That is why I bypassed you completely, Carlton, Elijah stated, his voice ringing with absolute finality. You are a thief and a coward. Aaliyah is the only person in this bloodline with actual integrity. She built her crisis management firm, never asking for a single handout. She possesses the exact same fire that I used to build my empire. I am formally declaring my granddaughter, Aaliyah Dubois, as the sole exclusive heir to my entire $52 million fortune. But I know you, Carlton, Elijah said, a dark, knowing smirk spreading across his weathered face. I knew you would eventually try to strip her of her dignity. I knew you would try to publicly disown her to save your own fragile ego. So I had Harrison draft a very specific contingency plan. I embedded a lethal final clause deep within the corporate structuring of the holding firm. Carlton slowly lifted his head from the marble floor, staring up at the massive glowing screen with wide eyes trembling in unadulterated terror. If my pathetic son ever attempts to officially disown my granddaughter Elijah, explained, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper, a hidden legal clause triggers across all my corporate entities. You see, Carlton, you never paid back the massive loans I gave you to keep your failing business afloat. I let them slide because you were my blood. But if you try to cast Aaliyah out, that grace period instantly expires. The moment you tried to disown her tonight, you activated the debt collection clause, Elijah stated, ruthlessly. Carlton, You now have exactly 24 hours to immediately repay the $2 million you embezzled from my company 10 years ago. Since Aaliyah now owns all my corporate assets, she is officially your primary creditor. You owe her $2 million in cash, Carlton, and if you do not pay her by tomorrow evening, she has my full legal blessing to seize every single asset you have left and throw you in federal prison for corporate embezzlement. Harrison did not wait for Valerie to formulate another screeching threat. He turned his back on her, completely dismissing her existence, and walked toward the audiovisual console behind the catering tables. He plugged a cable into his sleek silver tablet. Instantly, the enormous velvet curtains at the back of the grand ballroom automatically parted. A massive projector screen descended from the vaulted ceiling, whirring softly. The elite guests shifted uncomfortably, their eyes glued to the blinding white light flickering to life across the screen. Carlton let out a pathetic whimpering sound, recognizing the customized digital watermark of his father's personal legal firm flashing across the display. The screen crackled before resolving into a crystal-clear high-definition video. There, sitting behind his massive oak desk, was Grandpa Elijah. He did not look like a frail old man suffering from dementia. He wore a sharp-tailored three-piece suit. His posture was absolute granite, and his eyes burned with fierce, unyielding intensity. To prove his complete mental clarity, Elijah held up a copy of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. The date printed across the front page was exactly 3 days before his sudden passing. He set the newspaper down, folding his hands together, and stared directly into the camera lens, as if he could see straight into Carlton's miserable soul. If this video is playing right now, it means two things. Elijah began, his deep baritone voice rumbling through the surround sound speakers. First, it means I am dead. Second, it means my pathetic excuse for a son has finally pushed my brilliant granddaughter too far. I recorded this message because I knew exactly what would happen the moment my heart stopped beating. I knew the scavengers would start circling the estate, looking for whatever scraps they could tear away from the true heir. The camera angle widened, slightly capturing Elijah's cold, humorless smile. I am talking to you, Valerie, Elijah announced, his voice echoing with pure contempt. I know you are standing in that ballroom right now, plotting how to hire the sleaziest lawyers in Atlanta to contest my will. You thought I was just some senile old fool you could manipulate with fake smiles. I saw you counting my assets the day you married Carlton. You are nothing but a bottom-feeding gold digger who married a weak man to fund your desperate obsession with high society. You only care about showing off for people who despise you. You will not get a single dime of my money, Valerie. Valerie stood frozen in the middle of the ballroom, her face drained of all blood. She looked around at the wealthy socialites who were now openly staring at her with blatant, unapologetic disgust. She tried to open her mouth to defend herself, but no sound came out. Elijah's piercing gaze shifted to the next target. And Carlton, my massive disappointment of a son. Elijah continued, dropping to a lethal calm level. You spent your entire life obsessed with looking like a titan of industry. You threw lavish parties to impress investors who mock you behind your back. But we both know the brutal, ugly truth about how you built your logistics company, Carlton. We both know you are nothing but a fraud who built a house of cards on the grave of a better woman. Carlton collapsed forward onto his hands and knees, pressing his forehead against the cold marble floor. He clamped his hands over his ears, desperately trying to block out the booming voice of his dead father, but the speakers were relentless. 32 years ago, Carlton did not secure a brilliant business loan to start his logistics firm, Elijah declared, striking the desk with his fist. He stole the startup capital from Ialia's biological mother. My brilliant late daughter-in-law worked 3 jobs to save that money for her own future. When she passed away, Carlton did not put that money into a trust for his infant daughter. He drained her accounts and used her life savings to fund his own selfish ambitions. He stole from a grieving child just to buy his way into the country club. The massive ballroom erupted into horrified gasps as the terrible secret was finally exposed. I stood perfectly still, letting the undeniable truth wash over the stunned crowd. Carlton had always called me a burden, claiming he sacrificed everything to raise me. But in reality, my mother's death had financed his entire fake empire. That is why I bypassed you completely. Carlton Elijah stated, his voice ringing with absolute finality. You are a thief and a coward. Alia is the only person in this bloodline with actual integrity. She built her crisis management firm, never asking for a single handout. She possesses the exact same fire that I used to build my empire. I am formally declaring my granddaughter, Alia Dubois, as the sole exclusive heir to my entire $52 million fortune. But I know you, Carlton Elijah said, a dark, knowing smirk spreading across his weathered face. I knew you would eventually try to strip her of her dignity. I knew you would try to publicly disown her to save your own fragile ego. So I had Harrison draft a very specific contingency plan. I embedded a lethal final clause deep within the corporate structuring of the holding firm. Carlton slowly lifted his head from the marble floor, staring up at the massive glowing screen with wide eyes trembling in unadulterated terror. If my pathetic son ever attempts to officially disown my granddaughter Elijah, explained his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper, a hidden legal clause triggers across all my corporate entities. You see, Carlton, you never paid back the massive loans I gave you to keep your failing business afloat. I let them slide because you are my blood. But if you try to cast Aaliyah out, that grace period instantly expires. The moment you tried to disown her tonight, you activated the debt collection clause, Elijah stated, ruthlessly. Carlton, you now have exactly 24 hours to immediately repay the $2 million you embezzled from my company 10 years ago. Since Aaliyah now owns all my corporate assets, she is officially your primary creditor. You owe her $2 million in cash, Carlton, and if you do not pay her by tomorrow evening, she has my full legal blessing to seize every single asset you have left and throw you in federal prison for corporate embezzlement. The two federal agents did not give Connor another second to beg or negotiate. They hoisted him up by his expensive tailored jacket, pulling his arms tight enough to make him wince in pain. Connor stumbled forward, his polished shoes slipping on the polished marble floor as they marched him roughly toward the grand front doors of the mansion. He looked back at his white investment partners, pleading for them to call their legal teams. But they all turned away in absolute silence. Nobody was going to sink with his ship tonight. Sydney did not shed a single tear for her husband. Her eyes were completely dry and entirely devoid of any warmth. She grabbed her designer emerald clutch from a nearby catering table and fell into step right behind the federal agents. She clutched her cell phone, her thumb hovering over the digital folders containing every piece of cryptocurrency evidence the government needed to lock Connor away. Sydney did not look at her mother, and she did not look at Carlton. Her focus was entirely on saving herself and securing her immunity deal. She walked out, leaving the ruins of her marriage behind without a backward glance. Valerie stood watching her daughter disappear into the night. The heavy oak doors closed, sealing the fate of the Dubois family forever. The suffocating silence returned. Valerie slowly turned her head to look at my father. Carlton was still kneeling on the ground, staring blankly at the floorboards where the video had dismantled his life. He looked like an empty shell, drained of his arrogant pride. Valerie looked at Carlton in pure disgust. She reached down, grabbing his shoulder and giving him a violent shake. Her hands moved to her left ring finger, gripping the massive diamond ring Carlton had bought her for their anniversary. A ring likely purchased using embezzled funds. Valerie yanked the heavy diamond off her finger with a swift, aggressive motion. She threw the ring directly at Carlton's chest. The expensive jewelry bounced off his jacket and clattered against the marble floor, stopping near my feet. I am filing for divorce tomorrow morning, Valerie announced, her voice echoing with venomous finality. Enjoy your bankruptcy, you fraud. I am not spending another minute anchored to a broke man who cannot even afford the floor he is crying on. Carlton reached out, trying to grab the hem of Valerie's silk dress. His eyes were frantic, filled with the terror of a man realizing he was entirely alone. Valerie, please, Carlton begged, his voice cracking. Do not leave me like this. We built an empire together. We can rebuild everything if we just stick together. Valerie let out a cruel, barking laugh that completely shattered whatever delusion Carlton still held on to her. Laughter was devoid of any affection or warmth. It was the sound of a parasite realizing the host organism was fully dead and preparing to detach itself. We did not build an empire, Carlton Valerie sneered, kicking his hand away. You built a fragile house of cards using me as a prop to make yourself look legitimate. You really think I married you because I loved you? I married you because you were a convenient ATM, desperate for a trophy wife to elevate your country club status. I endured your pathetic need for validation just to ensure Sydney could live the luxury lifestyle she deserved. She leaned down, forcing Carlton to look directly into her calculating eyes. I never loved you, Carlton Valerie whispered harshly. You were nothing but a stepping stone, and now you are just dead weight. I am leaving tonight and taking whatever assets are legally tied to my name. You can rot in federal prison for all I care. Valerie stood up straight, smoothing the fabric of her ruined dress. Without looking at me, she turned on her heel and marched toward the side exit, heading straight to the master suite to pack her bags before the authorities could seize them. Carlton remained on his knees watching the woman he had chosen over his own daughter walk completely out of his life. The few elite guests who had stayed finally began moving toward the front doors. The whispers were brutal and relentless. Carlton's reputation was officially dead. He was no longer a respected logistics CEO or a figure in black excellence. He was a fraud, a thief, and a failure. Carlton slowly turned his body until he was facing me. I stood near the stage watching his pathetic display with absolute cold detachment. He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot and swollen from tears. The arrogant patriarch who had demanded my obedience just 30 minutes ago was completely gone in his place, was a desperate cornered animal. He pushed himself up from the floor, stumbling slightly before finding his balance. He took a slow, hesitant step toward me, holding his hands up in a gesture of absolute surrender. He wiped his face trying to pull together some shred of dignity, but failing miserably. Alia Carlton began, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. I am so sorry I was wrong about everything. I let Valerie poison my mind against you. I let my pride blind me to how brilliant you truly are. You are my daughter and I should have protected you, please. Alia, I am begging you as your father. Forgive me. I did not move a single muscle. I just stared at him, letting him drown in his own pathetic hypocrisy. He took another desperate step closer. I know I owe you $2 million from the trust clause, Carlton pleaded, his eyes searching my face for mercy. But my logistics company is on the brink of total collapse. The bank froze my credit lines today. If I default on my vendor payments tomorrow morning, the entire operation goes under, and 1,000 people lose their jobs. Please, Alia, you have $52 million. I just need a $5 million loan to stabilize the accounts and pay you back. Just $5 million to save my business. I looked at the man who had stolen my biological mother's life savings. I looked at the man who had cut off my college tuition and publicly humiliated me for my entire adult life. I let a slow, chilling smile spread across my face as I looked down at his begging hands. I let out a soft, cold laugh that cut straight to his core. Save it, I asked, tilting my head slightly. I already own it. The words hung in the stale air of the ruined ballroom, completely shattering the last remaining fragments of Carlton's sanity. He blinked rapidly, his tear-soaked eyelashes fluttering as he tried to comprehend the absolute impossibility of my statement. You cannot own my logistics company. Carlton stammered, his voice, barely a weak breath scratching against his throat. It is a private corporation. I am the founder and the majority shareholder. You cannot just buy it out from under me. I stepped closer to him, looking down at the exact spot where his expensive tuxedo met the wine-stained marble floor. You are a majority shareholder of a company that holds absolutely zero equity. Carlton, I explained, my voice echoing with clinical precision. You spent the last 5 years taking out massive high-interest loans from predatory shadow lenders just to keep your shipping trucks on the road, and Valerie in designer clothes. You thought you were playing the system, but you were just digging your own grave. Harrison stepped up beside me. opening a fresh file folder on his sleek tablet. He turned the screen toward my father, displaying a dizzying array of corporate acquisition documents. For the last 6 months, my firm has been executing the final phase of Project Alpha, I announced, projecting my voice so the remaining lingering guests could hear every single devastating detail. I used a fraction of Grandpa Elijah's $52 million fortune to quietly approach every single one of your desperate creditors. They knew your company was bleeding out, so they were absolutely thrilled to sell me your toxic debt for pennies on the dollar. Carlton's eyes widened in sheer unfiltered horror as he stared at the digital signatures on the screen. His hands began to shake so violently he had to press them flat against the floor just to keep himself propped up. You bought my debt, Carlton whispered, his brain finally catching up to the lethal reality of the trap I had built. I bought all of it. I confirmed my tone. Absolute ice. Every single loan, every single line of credit, every single outstanding vendor invoice. I consolidated your massive financial failures under my corporate holding firm. And because you missed your third consecutive payment deadline this morning, I officially triggered the default clauses hidden deep within those contracts at exactly 5 o'clock this evening, while you were busy putting on your tuxedo for this pathetic display of fake wealth. My legal team formally executed a hostile takeover. A profound, heavy silence settled over the room. The sheer strategic brilliance of the takeover left the remaining high society elites completely speechless. Carlton let out a ragged, agonizing gasp, clutching his chest, as if his heart was literally breaking in two. I looked down at him, remembering every time he made me feel worthless. Do you remember my Carlton, I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I asked you for a small seed investment. You laughed right in my face. You told me to find a rich husband because a woman could never survive a corporate boardroom. You said business required a masculine intellect. I lacked. Carlton squeezed his eyes shut, tears spilling as his own sexist words were weaponized against him. You were right about one thing, Carlton, I continued, relentlessly. Corporate boardrooms are absolutely brutal, but the fatal mistake you made was assuming I needed your permission to enter one. You thought being a man automatically made you a titan of industry, but you are nothing but a weak, desperate fraud who used my dead mother's life savings to play pretend. I am the one with the ruthless intellect. I am the one who orchestrated the most aggressive corporate takeover in Atlanta history without you ever suspecting a thing. I did not just survive the boardroom. Carlton, I bought the entire building. The sheer weight of his complete and total defeat finally crushed whatever fighting spirit Carlton had left. He slumped forward, burying his face in his hands, sobbing with the wretched, pathetic sound of a man who had lost his company, his mansion, his wife, and his dignity in a single night. What am I supposed to do? Carlton wept, rocking back and forth on his knees. My entire life is in that company. All my client relationships, all my contracts. Who is going to run the day-to-day operations? You do not know the first thing about managing a national logistics supply chain. Leah. The entire infrastructure will collapse by Monday morning without me. I let out a sharp, dry laugh that cut through his miserable sobbing. You are absolutely right, Carlton. My voice dripping with pure vindictive satisfaction. I do not know anything about running a national logistics supply chain. My expertise is in destroying reputations and orchestrating hostile takeovers. But I am a brilliant CEO, which means I know exactly how to delegate to the right people. I raised my right hand into the air and snapped my fingers with a loud, sharp crack that echoed across the ballroom. A woman stepped out from the shadows. She wore a tailored crimson pantsuit, her natural hair styled in a crown of silver curls. She walked with a powerful grace, demanding absolute respect from everyone. Carlton lifted his face from his hands, his eyes locked onto her, and the blood drained from his face again. He let out a choked gasp, scrambling backward as if he had seen a ghost. You! Carlton stammered, his voice shaking with absolute terror. What are you doing here? Get out of this house. The woman stopped beside me, smiling coldly. She ignored the ruined ballroom, staring only at the pathetic man kneeling in spilled wine. You stole my sister's life savings 20 years ago. Carlton, the woman said, her voice smooth and lethal. You pushed me out of the original partnership and blacklisted me from the Atlanta business community. just so you could take all the credit for the empire we built together. You thought you erased me completely, but you forgot that karma always collects its debts. I looked down at my father, savoring the absolute shock and despair radiating from his broken posture. The final piece of the puzzle had clicked perfectly into place, securing my ultimate victory. I believe you two already know each other, I announced, my voice ringing with triumphant finality. But allow me to reintroduce you. Meet your new CEO, Carlton. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom slammed open, breaking the silence that had settled over the ruined space. Sydney staggered back inside, looking absolutely nothing like the polished high society princess who had confidently tossed red wine on my silk dress just an hour ago. Her emerald gown was wrinkled, and her styled hair was a disheveled mess. She had just finished throwing her own husband to the federal agents trading his freedom for her immunity deal. She walked back into the mansion, expecting to find her mother and Carlton figuring out a new strategy. Instead, she found a graveyard of broken egos. She saw Carlton kneeling on the floor, weeping uncontrollably. She saw Valerie nowhere to be found, having already abandoned ship. Sydney stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes darting frantically around the massive room. The reality of her situation hit her with the force of a freight train. Connor was going to federal prison, and all his offshore accounts were seized. Her mother had fled the estate. Carlton's logistics empire now belonged entirely to me. Sydney had absolutely no money, no husband, and no social standing left in Atlanta. She was completely broke and staring at the one person she had spent her life tormenting. I watched Sydney's posture completely change as her survival instincts kicked in. The arrogant glare she usually wore vanished completely. She forced her facial features into a pathetic mask of vulnerability. She took a slow, hesitant step toward me, her hands clasped tightly together. She tried to muster a warm smile, but her lips trembled violently, betraying her absolute terror. She walked past her broken father without glancing down, focusing all her desperate energy solely on me. Alia, Sydney began, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet fake affection that made my skin crawl. That was so incredibly brave of you, taking down Connor like that. I had no idea he was a criminal embezzling money from his partners. You really saved me from being dragged down with him. You are always so smart and resourceful. I did not say a single word, letting the silence stretch out, forcing her to squirm under my cold, detached gaze. She took another step closer, reaching out as if to hold my hand, but quickly pulled back when I did not move an inch. Look, I know things have been tense between us tonight, Sydney continued, her voice pitching higher in desperation. But with Mom leaving and Carlton losing the company, we are the only family each other has left. This mansion is massive, Aaliyah. You cannot possibly live here all by yourself. It makes perfect sense for me to stay in my suite upstairs. We can be roommates just like real sisters. And since Connor left me with nothing, I could come work for you. Your crisis management firm is brilliant. I have amazing social connections in the Buckhead elite circle. I could be your vice president of public relations. We could run Atlanta together side by side. The sheer audacity of her request hung in the air. She had just spent the entire evening mocking my career, calling me a glorified maid for scandals, and trying to help her husband steal my inheritance. Now she was standing in my foreclosed mansion, begging for a free room and an executive salary. I tilted my head, studying her pathetic performance. You want to be my vice president of public relations? I asked, my voice smooth and dangerously quiet. You want to live in my house and play sisters with me? Sydney nodded eagerly, tears welling up in her eyes right on cue. Yes, Alia, I really do. We can finally bond and be the family we were always meant to be. I let out a short, bitter laugh, shaking my head slowly. You do not know the first thing about being a sister, Sydney, I replied, the coldness in my voice making her flinch. You have spent the last 20 years making sure I knew exactly how little I meant to you. Do not stand here and pretend we have some deep familial bond just because your bank accounts are suddenly frozen. I took a deliberate step toward her. You think I forgot how you treated me when we were growing up? I asked, my words striking her like physical blows. I remember every single time you mocked my natural hair, telling your white friends at the country club that I looked unkempt and unprofessional just because I refused to burn my scalp with chemical relaxers like Valerie demanded. I remember you throwing away my customized business suits, claiming they looked cheap because they did not have a luxury European designer label plastered across the chest. You spent your entire adult life treating me like a social disease. I continued relentlessly. You told everyone who would listen that my career was a joke. You spent years parading Connor around this house, holding up his white corporate pedigree as the ultimate standard of success, while treating my black-owned business like a pathetic hobby. You bullied me, you humiliated me, and you tried to help them steal my grandfather's money tonight. And now that you have absolutely nothing left, you want to play the sister card. Sydney's fake composure completely crumbled. Genuine tears spilled down her cheeks, ruining her expensive makeup. She dropped to her knees right in front of me, grabbing the hem of my ivory dress with trembling hands. I am so sorry, Aaliyah. Sydney sobbed, her voice cracking with raw desperation. You have to believe me. I never wanted to treat you like that. Mom made me do it. Valerie forced me to be cruel to you because she felt threatened by your intelligence. She told me if I did not help her keep you down, she would cut off my shopping allowances. I was just following her orders so I could survive in this toxic house. I love you, sis. I really do love you. Please do not throw me out on the street. I have nowhere else to go. I looked down at her pathetic weeping form. She was trying to use the exact same manipulation tactics her mother had perfected, but I was completely immune to her toxic games. I slowly reached into my clutch and pulled out my smartphone. The screen glowed brightly in the dim lighting of the ruined ballroom. You only did it because Valerie made you, I repeated, tapping the screen of my phone. You love me, and you just want us to be real sisters. Yes, Elia, Sydney cried, nodding frantically, looking up at me with wide, hopeful eyes. I swear it on my life. That is very interesting, Sydney, I said, holding the glowing phone screen up so she could see the digital text message log displayed on it. Because my corporate security team has been monitoring Connor's digital communications for the past 3 days, building the embezzlement file for the feds. And they happened to intercept a very specific text message that you sent to his private phone yesterday afternoon, right after Valerie handed me those trust relinquishment documents. Sydney's eyes locked onto the screen, and all the breath left her lungs. She froze completely, her hands dropping from my dress as if the fabric had suddenly caught fire. Would you like me to read it out loud for the room? I asked, my voice echoing with lethal finality. I tapped the message and read her exact words slowly and clearly. Once we get the trust, I am framing Aaliyah for tax fraud so she rots in jail. The absolute silence in the ballroom amplified the pure wickedness of her own words. Sydney could not deny it, and she could not escape it. She was caught in her own malicious trap, completely destroyed by the exact same greed that had just brought down her husband and her mother. Sydney stared at the glowing screen of my phone, her body vibrating with a terrifying realization. The malicious text message completely exposed her treachery to the room. Without a word of defense, Sydney spun around and bolted toward the grand foyer. Her heels slipped on the spilled wine as she sprinted toward the front doors, sobbing hysterically as she ran out into the humid Atlanta night, leaving her ruined marriage behind her. The entrance doors slammed shut violently, rattling the chandeliers hanging above our heads. I watched her disappear into the darkness, feeling nothing but sweet vindication. The ballroom was mostly empty now, save for a few lingering guests, too captivated by the destruction of the Dubois family to leave their spots. Valerie realized she was now completely alone in her fight for survival. Her daughter had abandoned her to save herself from federal prosecution. Her husband was kneeling on the floor, stripped of his logistics company and his pride. Valerie's eyes darted wildly around the room, calculating her final move to secure some form of wealth. She looked at the marble pillars and the elaborate decorations before her gaze locked onto the walls of the grand estate. Lining the velvet walls were dozens of rare West African tribal masks and ancient carved wooden statues beautifully illuminated by custom lighting. Carlton had spent decades curating that expensive collection to prove his elite cultural status to his wealthy white investor friends. Valerie let out a guttural noise that sounded like a wounded animal trapped in a corner. She kicked off her designer heels, leaving them discarded on the cold marble floor. She charged toward the nearest wall, grabbing a massive wooden ceremonial shield, pulling it violently off its heavy brass hook. The heavy shield clattered loudly against the floorboards as she dragged it toward the center of the room, scratching the hardwood surface. She did not stop there. Valerie sprinted to the next display, ripping a beautiful beaded tapestry from its glass casing, shattering the frame into jagged pieces. "What are you doing, Valerie?" Carlton croaked, his voice raw and pathetic as he watched his wife tear apart his gallery wall. "I am taking what is legally mine." Valerie shrieked, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings like a banshee. She marched over to a display of carved ivory figures, sweeping them into her arms with reckless, desperate greed, letting several pieces fall and break at her feet. "If you are broke, and this house belongs to your ungrateful daughter, then I am taking every piece of art in this room. They are marital assets acquired during our marriage, and I have a legal right to half of everything you own. I endured 10 years of your suffocating ego and your fake country club lifestyle. I smiled at your boring investor dinners while you paraded me around like a trophy. I earned these millions to cover my emotional distress. I am taking this entire collection to an auction house tomorrow, and I am going to live comfortably in Paris while you rot in a federal prison cell." Valerie continued her manic rampage, ripping down a set of bronze casting plates and dropping them onto the pile she was building in the middle of the dance floor. She was panting heavily, her silk blouse torn at the shoulder from her frantic exertion and her perfect hair sticking wildly to her sweating forehead. She looked absolutely deranged, clutching a carved wooden mask to her chest, like a shield against the crushing reality of her financial ruin. She glared at me, daring me to step forward and stop her. "These do not belong to you." Alia Valerie spat, venom dripping from every syllable she forced out of her mouth. "The deed to the house does not include personal marital property or decorative investments. You might own the walls, but you do not own the millions of dollars hanging on them. I am walking out of here a rich woman, and there is nothing you or your lawyer can do to stop me from taking what I deserve." I did not even bother to take a single step toward her. I simply stood there looking down at the pathetic pile of artifacts she had gathered on the floor like a scavenger. I slowly turned my head and looked at Harrison, who was already anticipating my next move. My attorney did not need a verbal command to destroy her final delusion. He stepped forward, holding his sleek silver tablet in one hand and reaching deep into his leather briefcase with the other. Harrison pulled out a stack of certified appraiser documents, stamped with the seal of the most prestigious art authentication firm in Atlanta. He walked calmly across the room, stopping a few feet away from Valerie's stolen treasure hoard, looking at her with pure professional disdain. "Leave them right there!" Valerie, Harrison commanded, his voice echoing with absolute authority across the silent ballroom. "You are going to want to put that wooden mask down before you embarrass yourself any further tonight." Valerie clutched the mask tighter against her chest, her eyes narrowing in fierce defiance. "These are authentic tribal artifacts," she hissed venomously. "They are worth at least $4 million on the private market, and they are my ticket out of this miserable city." Harrison let out a short, dry laugh, tossing the stack of appraiser documents directly onto her pathetic pile of stolen art, causing the papers to scatter across the bronze plates. "They are absolutely worthless replicas," Harrison announced, watching the color drain completely from Valerie's panicked face. "Your husband secretly sold every single original authentic piece to a private anonymous buyer in Dubai exactly 3 years ago. He desperately needed the cash to pay off a massive underground gambling debt he accumulated trying to keep up with Connor's elite investment buddies. The pieces hanging on these walls are nothing but cheap knockoffs manufactured in a generic tourist gift shop overseas. They are not worth the cheap wood they are carved on, and they certainly will not pay for your flight to Paris." Valerie dropped the mask in pure shock. It hit the floor with a hollow plastic thud that confirmed everything Harrison just said, proving the collection was a complete counterfeit sham. She stared at Carlton, who squeezed his eyes shut in absolute shame, unable to look his furious wife in the face. Valerie threw her head back, staring at the chandelier above, and let out a blood-curdling scream of pure, unadulterated agony that echoed deep into the dark Atlanta night. "When my father married a woman who worshipped country club status over her own soul, I made a choice. I kept the $52 million. My late grandfather left me an absolute secret. It turned out to be the smartest decision I ever made." I watched my father and his new family flaunt their leased luxury cars and brag about their fake wealth waiting for the inevitable collapse. They treated me like an outsider in my own bloodline. Just days later, my father's new wife showed up at my door uninvited, with a sleazy lawyer at her side, demanding I hand over what little money they thought I had. They had no idea they were walking straight into a trap that would tear their entire empire apart by midnight. If you have ever been treated like the family disappointment while building a kingdom in the shadows, stay with me. You will want to hear exactly how I burned their perfect image to the ground. The pounding on my apartment door was so violent it rattled the doorframe. Valerie barged in her designer heels, clicking aggressively against my hardwood floor. She was my father's new wife, a woman who treated Atlanta high society like a blood sport. Right behind her was a man in a cheap suit carrying a leather briefcase looking like an ambulance chaser. Valerie did not bother with a greeting. She marched straight to my glass coffee table, her gaze sweeping over my work documents with absolute disdain, and slammed a thick stack of legal papers right on top of my morning notes. "Sign it," she ordered, crossing her arms over her silk blouse. "I am not playing games today, Aliyah. Your father and I have a major anniversary gala to host tonight, and I need this finalized before the caterers arrive." I looked down at the documents, then back up at her perfectly contoured face, asking what exactly I was supposed to be signing at 8 in the morning. Her lawyer stepped forward, clearing his throat with a self-important smirk. "It is the standard relinquishment of assets," he explained. "You are transferring the management of the small trust fund your grandfather left you over to your father. It is entirely legal and highly recommended for family wealth consolidation." I asked Valerie why my father needed my tiny trust fund consolidated right now. Valerie rolled her eyes, scoffing loudly. "Because Carlton needs the liquid cash to secure a board seat for Connor," she snapped. "Sydney's husband needs that position to elevate our family status. Sydney is the perfect daughter because she married a man who actually understands how the world works. Connor is a top-tier investment director. He is white, he is wealthy, and he opens doors. Your father desperately needs opened to keep his logistics business relevant in this modern, cutthroat market. We have a pristine image of Black excellence to maintain in this city, and we absolutely cannot afford to look weak in front of the elite investors tonight. You, on the other hand, do absolutely nothing to contribute to this family's prestige." She paced across my living room, looking around my understated apartment with pure disgust. "Look at you, Aaliyah. You are 32 years old and still single. You refuse to get an advanced business degree or marry a successful surgeon like your perfect stepsister did. Instead, you run some pathetic crisis management firm. You are essentially a glorified maid for scandals, cleaning up the messes of disgraced politicians. Let the real men handle the high-level finances." The audacity of her words hung in the air. She was demanding I hand over a decoy trust fund to feed the ambitions of an arrogant white savior who treated our family like his personal charity project. My grandfather Elijah built his real estate empire from the ground up. He knew exactly how greedy Valerie was, and how weak my father Carlton had become under her superficial toxic influence. That was why the trust fund she was currently pointing at held exactly $100,000, while the $52 million Elijah actually left me was completely hidden. It was secured in untouchable offshore accounts under my corporate entity, far away from their greedy hands. They were completely clueless about the massive fortune I controlled in the shadows, while they paraded around Atlanta playing pretend. My father was drowning in massive debt, and Valerie was trying to scavenge my crumbs to buy her son-in-law a seat at a table they could no longer afford. I picked up the stack of papers. I did not take the pen. Instead, I carefully folded the documents in half and handed them back to her lawyer. "I am not signing this here," I said, my voice steady and cold. Valerie's smile vanished instantly. "What do you mean you are not signing?" she demanded, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. "You will sign it right now, or your father will publicly disown you tonight in front of the entire city." I stood up, looking down at her. "That sounds like a wonderful plan," I replied calmly. "I will bring these documents to the anniversary gala tonight. Let my father ask me for my money in public." Let him stand in front of all his wealthy friends and beg his disappointing daughter for a handout. Valerie turned bright red, snatching the papers from her lawyer. The look of pure disgust on her face was priceless as she realized I was not going to be bullied in my own home. Fine, she hissed. Be difficult and see where it gets you. But when you show up tonight, you better have a pen ready, or you are completely dead to this family. She spun around and stormed out of my apartment, her lawyer scurrying out right behind her. The heavy door clicked shut, leaving me in total silence. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed my corporate attorney. Harrison answered on the very first ring. I did not bother saying hello. Valerie just left my apartment, I told him. She brought the relinquishment papers. They are desperate enough to force my hand at the gala tonight. I heard Harrison chuckle softly. Initiate Project Alpha, I instructed him, my voice turning to absolute ice. Gather the federal filings and the secret foreclosure deeds. We are burning their empire down tonight. Valerie's agonizing scream hung in the air of the grand ballroom, refusing to dissipate. She collapsed onto the cold marble floor, her shaking hands tangled in her own ruined hair, surrounded by the shattered pieces of fake wood and cheap bronze. Carlton remained paralyzed on his knees, his eyes vacant as the absolute finality of his financial destruction settled over him. The elite guests stood frozen in a collective state of morbid fascination. These were prominent politicians and legacy families who usually hid their dirty scandals behind closed doors. Tonight, they had front-row seats to the most spectacular public execution the city had ever witnessed, and none could look away from the wreckage. The crowd slowly parted as a tall, distinguished man pushed his way to the front. It was Mr. Crawford, the notoriously strict president of the most exclusive country club in Georgia. He wore a perfectly tailored tuxedo and an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. Carlton had worshipped the ground Mr. Crawford walked on for decades, considering his platinum membership the ultimate validation of his black excellence facade. Seeing the club president step forward, Carlton let out a pathetic whimpering sound. He tried to push himself up his wine-stained pants, clinging to his shaking legs. "Mr. Crawford, please." Carlton begged, his voice cracking as he reached out a trembling hand. "This is a terrible misunderstanding. My daughter is just confused. I can explain everything if you give me a moment in your private office." Mr. Crawford did not take a single step backward, looking down at my father as if he were a diseased rat. "There is nothing left to explain. Carlton," Mr. Crawford said, his voice booming with aristocratic authority. "You spent the last hour demonstrating what a complete and utter fraud you are. I watched you try to steal from your own blood and watched you weep when she outsmarted you. What truly sickens me is your absolute lack of basic integrity. You stood in my private office yesterday morning, begging for an extension on your club dues. You looked me dead in the eye and blamed your missed payments on a sophisticated banking error, swearing the funds would clear by Monday." Mr. Crawford gestured around the ruined ballroom, his face twisting with raw contempt. "You have not paid your monthly membership dues in 8 months, Carlton. You currently owe the club over $40,000 in arrears, and yet you threw a lavish catered event tonight just to parade your fake wealth in front of the very people you owe money to. You are not a titan of industry bringing prestige to our community. You are a common street swindler wearing a rented tuxedo, playing pretend in a house you do not even own." Valerie tried to crawl toward Mr. Crawford, her expensive makeup running down her cheeks in thick black rivers. "Please, Mr. Crawford," she sobbed desperately, grabbing at the hem of his tailored trousers. "You cannot take away our membership. We belong at the club. I will give you anything you want to cover the balance." She wildly pointed at the pile of fake artifacts on the floor. "Take the art pieces as collateral. I swear we will pay you back the rest tomorrow morning in cash." Mr. Crawford kicked his leg free from her grasp with a look of pure revulsion. "You do not have any friends, Valerie," he replied coldly. "You only have audiences, and your tragic show is officially over. Offering me cheap plastic tourist souvenirs to cover a $40,000 debt is an insult to my intelligence. As the president of the board of directors, I am publicly revoking your lifetime memberships effective immediately. You and your disgraced husband are both permanently banned from the premises. If either of you ever steps foot on the golf course again, I will personally have armed security escort you off the property in handcuffs. Mr. Crawford turned his back on the weeping couple and walked toward the grand exit, signaling to the elite crowd that it was finally time to abandon the sinking ship. The wealthy socialites began filing out in droves, whispering harshly about the disgraced patriarch sobbing on the floor. Before the room could completely empty, a new figure marched up to the silver microphone still standing on the jazz stage. It was the head director of the luxury catering company, wearing a crisp white apron over his dark suit. He tapped the microphone twice, sending a sharp feedback screech through the room, making Carlton violently flinch. The caterer glared down at my broken father with zero professional courtesy left in his eyes. "Excuse me," the catering director announced, his voice echoing loudly through the rapidly emptying ballroom. "I really do not mean to interrupt this pathetic family tragedy, but we have a massive logistical problem here. You ordered imported beluga caviar Wagyu beef sliders and 50 bottles of vintage French champagne for this little fake billionaire masquerade. Since Mr. Dubois is completely broke and his corporate credit lines are completely frozen, who exactly is paying for the $50,000 catering bill tonight?" The caterer crossed his muscular arms, glaring directly at Carlton's trembling shoulders. Carlton looked up at the catering director, his face a portrait of absolute panic. He frantically patted the pockets of his ruined tuxedo jacket as if a stack of $100 bills might magically appear. "Please," Carlton stammered, his voice barely a squeak. "Just give me until the end of the week. I can liquidate some warehouse equipment. I can call my secondary vendors. Do not take the food away while my guests are still here. It will ruin the last shred of my reputation." The catering director let out a harsh, mocking laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. "Your reputation is already dead on the floor, buddy," the caterer shot back aggressively. "I am not running a charity kitchen for broke men trying to impress politicians. My staff worked 14 hours today to set up this extravagant buffet, and I am not letting them go home without their paychecks. We are cutting the music, draining the chocolate fountains, and locking up the liquor cabinets immediately. Grab the boxes, boys," the caterer yelled, turning his back on Carlton. "Unless someone hands me a working black Amex card in the next 30 seconds, we are shutting this circus down right now." The catering director nodded respectfully, tucking my black card into his apron pocket and barking orders at his staff to keep the silver trays full. Carlton watched the exchange with hollow, bloodshot eyes, his jaw trembling as he realized I had just effortlessly bought the loyalty of the very people he had tried to impress. The elite guests who were edging toward the exits paused, their morbid curiosity anchoring them to the marble floor. Carlton looked up at me with a pathetic, shattered expression, folding his hands together in a desperate, pleading gesture. "Alia, please," Carlton sobbed, his voice echoing weakly across the massive ballroom. "Stop doing this to me. Elijah would not want this. Your grandfather built this family name with pride. He believed in our legacy. He would be absolutely sickened to see you humiliating your own father in front of the entire city. You are destroying everything he worked so hard to build. Please just show some mercy, and let me keep a shred of my dignity for his sake." I looked down at the man who had tormented me my entire life, feeling absolutely no pity in my heart. I let out a sharp, humorless laugh that cut right through his pathetic manipulation attempt. "Do not you dare invoke Grandpa Elijah's name to save your fragile ego." "Carlton," I fired back, my voice projecting with lethal clarity. "Elijah built a legacy based on actual hard work and unshakable integrity. He marched for civil rights while you sat in country clubs kissing up to the men who redlined our neighborhoods. You do not know the first thing about Black excellence, Carlton. You just bought a subscription to it using my dead mother's money." Carlton flinched violently, as if I had physically struck him across the face, but I did not stop. I stepped closer, closing the distance between us, forcing him to look up into my cold, unrelenting eyes. "You spent 32 years trying to convince Atlanta that you were the pinnacle of Black prestige." I continued, my words falling like hammer strikes. "You leased luxury cars you could not afford and hung fake art on your walls to impress politicians who never respected you. You thought real power was wearing a custom tuxedo to charity galas, but true legacy is built on character, and you are completely bankrupt in that department." I paced slowly around his kneeling figure, making sure every wealthy socialite in the room heard exactly what kind of monster was hiding behind his tailored suits. You preached about family values, but sacrificed your daughter's mental health just to maintain your perfect social facade, I announced, pointing down at him. Do you remember when I was 23 years old, Carlton? Do you remember when I was hospitalized for severe panic attacks? Because the pressure of running my startup was literally destroying my body. Carlton's eyes widened in sheer panic, trying to shake his head to stop me from exposing his darkest failures, but I refused to be silenced. I called you from my hospital bed begging for emotional support. I said, my voice ringing with righteous fury. And do you remember what you told me, Carlton? You told me to stop embarrassing the Dubois name. You told me depression was a weakness that rich black families did not have the luxury of experiencing. You refused to pay for my therapy, but the very next morning you bought a luxury sports car to show off at a golf tournament. You chose your country club status over my survival every single time. I relentlessly continued stripping away the very last shred of his fake dignity. When my biological mother died, you did not comfort me. You immediately started looking for a trophy wife like Valerie because you needed a pretty accessory to climb the social ladder. You stepped on my throat my entire life just to make yourself look taller. You are not a patriarch, Carlton. You are a parasite. Carlton slumped forward, letting his head hang in absolute total defeat. His chest heaved with heavy, agonizing sobs. The grand illusion he had dedicated his entire miserable existence to maintaining was completely incinerated. He had no money, no wife, no prestige, and absolutely zero respect left in the city of Atlanta. The ballroom was completely silent, except for the pathetic sound of his wretched weeping. He stayed on the floor completely stripped of his pride, his arrogance, and his fake excellence. He slowly tilted his head up, his face slick with tears and sweat, looking like a man who had just been sentenced to life in a psychological prison of his own making. What am I supposed to do now? Carlton whispered, his voice cracking into a miserable, helpless whine. I do not have a company. I do not have a home. I have absolutely $0 in my bank account, and every bridge in this city is completely burned. What am I supposed to do, Aaliyah? I stared down at him, feeling the ultimate sweet rush of pure, unadulterated victory. The scales of justice had finally tipped permanently in my favor. I did not feel an ounce of guilt. I felt absolutely liberated. I unclasped my designer silk clutch and reached inside. I deliberately bypassed my keys and my phone, pulling out a single neatly folded piece of crisp white printer paper. I held it between my fingers, looking at him with a gaze as cold as absolute zero. My crisis management firm is currently expanding our corporate headquarters, I announced, my voice smooth and devoid of any emotion. We just signed 3 new major corporate clients yesterday morning. As a result, our administrative department is currently understaffed, and we are actively hiring for the mailroom. I let the document unfold, letting it flutter slightly in the air conditioning of the grand ballroom. It was a standard entry-level employment application. The position pays minimum wage, I stated flatly, watching his eyes widen in fresh, humiliating horror. You get 0 benefits, no paid time off, and you report directly to a 22-year-old intern who does not care about your fake country club stories. I dropped the piece of paper, letting it drift slowly down until it landed right on the wine-stained marble floor, directly between his trembling hands. Fill out the application. Carlton, I said, turning my back on him completely, and I might grant you an interview. I looked around the ruined ballroom, letting the absolute devastation of my enemies sink into the polished marble floor. My biological aunt stood proudly by my side, holding the corporate takeover documents, while Carlton remained hunched over in a pathetic weeping pile. The elite guests who had lingered to watch the final act of this tragedy were utterly silent, too captivated by the sheer magnitude of the downfall to whisper. I turned my attention back to the weeping patriarch and the furious stepmother who had just realized she was ruined. Listen to me very carefully, because I am only going to say this once, I announced, my voice projecting with crisp corporate authority over the chaotic sound of Carlton's ragged breathing. You have exactly 24 hours to pack up your miserable lives and vacate my property. By this time tomorrow evening, my private security contractors will be standing at the front gates. You are allowed to take your clothing, your personal toiletries, and whatever cheap costume jewelry Valerie has left in her safes. You will not touch the fixtures, you will not take the furniture, and you will absolutely not attempt to dismantle any smart home technology on your way out. If a single silver spoon is missing, I will have Harrison file theft charges before you even reach the city limits. Valerie froze. The wild, feral energy that had consumed her during her pathetic art heist completely evaporated. She dropped the worthless wooden mask she had been clutching. It rolled across the floor, hitting Carlton's knee. Valerie looked at the front doors where Sydney had abandoned her to save herself. She looked at the empty space where Connor had been dragged away in federal handcuffs. Then she looked at Carlton, who could not even afford to buy her a cup of coffee, much less a plane ticket. She was completely cornered with absolutely zero financial options left in the entire state of Georgia. I watched her brain rapidly calculate her survival odds. The arrogant high society predator vanished instantly. In her place, a trembling, terrified woman emerged. Valerie slowly sank down onto the wine-stained floorboards right next to the scattered bank statements that had ruined her son-in-law. She dropped to her bare knees, clasping her manicured hands tightly together in front of her chest. Real heavy tears began to well up in her eyes, spilling over her thick false lashes and running down her perfectly contoured cheeks. "Alia, please!" Valerie whimpered, her voice cracking with a masterfully conjured display of raw vulnerability. She crawled forward on her knees, closing the distance between us, until she was looking up at me with wide, pleading eyes. "Please do not throw me out on the street. I have absolutely nothing left. You have to understand my position. Carlton lied to me for years about our financial security. He manipulated me just like he manipulated you. We are both victims of his toxic ego." I tilted my head, staring down at her pathetic performance. She actually thought she could play the victim card after spending the last decade making my life a living hell. "You are so brilliant, Aaliyah," Valerie sobbed, reaching out a trembling hand toward the hem of my gown. "You are the smartest, most capable woman I have ever met in my entire life. You built this massive empire all by yourself. You are the daughter I always wished I had. Look at Sydney. She is weak and superficial. She ran away. The second things got difficult. But you stayed and fought. You are exactly the kind of strong, fearless woman I always prayed I could raise." I did not say a single word. I let her dig her own grave deeper with every sycophantic lie she spewed, trying to save herself. "I know I was hard on you growing up," Valerie cried, her voice dripping with manufactured remorse. "I know I said cruel things about your natural hair and your clothes, but you have to understand why I did it, Aaliyah. I saw your potential from the very beginning. I knew Carlton was too weak to guide you, and I knew the world was going to be brutal to a young black woman trying to make it in corporate Atlanta. I was tough on you because I had to make you strong. I had to apply the pressure to turn you into a diamond. Every single time I insulted you, I was just preparing you for the ruthless reality of the boardroom. My tough love worked beautifully. You conquered everything. The sheer psychological gymnastics required to reframe 20 years of relentless emotional abuse and blatant racism as maternal tough love was absolutely staggering." Valerie pressed her hands against her chest, weeping loudly. "Just let me stay in the guest house," Valerie begged, bowing her head toward my heels. "I do not need the master suite or the luxury cars. Just let me live in the small guest cottage by the pool. I will earn my keep, Aaliyah. I can be your social advisor. I know everyone in the Buckhead elite circle. I can help you navigate the charity galas and the political fundraisers. I will be your most loyal asset. Please do not leave me homeless. I love you like my own blood." I stared down at her kneeling figure, feeling nothing but absolute profound disgust. She was a parasite desperately trying to attach herself to a new host before the old one fully expired. I slowly reached into my designer clutch and pulled out my smartphone. The device was still wirelessly connected to the massive audio-visual system that Harrison had used to play Grandpa Elijah's final message. "You really expect me to believe you pushed me out of maternal love?" I asked, my voice smooth and chillingly detached. You expect me to believe you harbor genuine affection for my bloodline, Valerie. Yes, Aaliyah, Valerie sobbed, nodding her head frantically. I swear it on my life. I always wanted the best for you and your grandfather Elijah. I let out a dark, sharp laugh that echoed through the grand ballroom. That is a fascinating narrative, Valerie, I replied, holding my phone up so the glowing screen illuminated the darkness between us. Because my crisis management team did not just intercept Sydney's text messages to Connor. We also pulled the archived voicemail records from the private landline at Grandpa Elijah's nursing facility. Valerie's weeping instantly stopped. Her body went entirely rigid, as if she had been struck by lightning. The fake tears dried up, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. I tapped a single audio file on my screen. The ballroom speakers roared to life, projecting a crisp, crystal-clear voicemail recorded exactly 1 week ago. The heavy acoustics of the room amplified Valerie's vicious, impatient voice for everyone to hear. Carlton, if your dad does not hand over the money soon, I am going to slip something into his tea to speed up his heart condition so we can finally collect what is ours. The crystal clear audio of the voicemail hung in the dead silent air of the grand ballroom for a fraction of a second before utter pandemonium broke loose. A collective horrified gasp ripped through the crowd of elite socialites. Several politicians physically backed away from Valerie, as if she were carrying a highly contagious disease. Carlton let out a strangled, agonizing noise, scrambling away from the woman he had chosen over his own flesh and blood. The realization that his trophy wife was actively plotting to murder his elderly father completely shattered his fragile mind. Valerie scrambled backward on her bare knees, her expensive silk skirt tangling around her legs as she tried to distance herself from the glowing screen in my hand. The sycophantic tears she had just been crying magically vanished, leaving behind a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for a single sympathetic face among the wealthy guests. But she found absolutely nothing but intense, overwhelming disgust. She pressed her back against a marble pillar, breathing heavily, realizing there was no way out of this trap. That is a fake! Valerie shrieked, her voice pitching into a desperate, shrill frequency, making the catering staff wince. She pointed a shaking finger at my smartphone, her chest heaving violently. You fabricated that audio. Aaliyah, you used artificial intelligence to generate a deep fake of my voice, just to frame me. Carlton, you cannot believe that recording is real. She is trying to destroy our marriage because she is jealous of our bond. I would never hurt Elijah. I loved your father. Carlton could not even look at her. He pulled his knees to his chest, rocking back and forth on the wine-stained floor, completely paralyzed by the sheer volume of betrayals he had suffered in the last hour. The man who prized his country club reputation. Above his daughters, mental health was now publicly exposed as a man whose own wife wanted to assassinate his father for cash. I did not even bother to dignify her pathetic deepfake excuse. With a response, I simply stepped aside, letting Harrison take the floor. My corporate attorney adjusted his cuffs, looking down at the groveling stepmother with an expression of absolute professional contempt. He walked slowly toward her, holding a thick manila envelope sealed with red tape. You really should keep up with modern telecom compliance laws, Valerie Harrison announced, his voice projecting smoothly over the chaotic murmurs of the ballroom. Alaya did not generate a single second of that audio file. My legal team obtained a federal subpoena for the private landline at Elijah's nursing facility last month. We requested the raw, unedited server data directly from the telecommunications provider. That recording is completely authentic and time-stamped with your exact cellular network IP address. Valerie's mouth dropped open. Her jaw, trembling so violently, her teeth clicked together. She tried to formulate another lie to spin another desperate narrative, but Harrison did not give her the space to breathe. We did not just hold on to that audio for dramatic effect tonight. Harrison continued, his tone, dropping to a lethal serious level. Alaya hired me to manage her corporate assets, but she also pays me a generous retainer to handle legal liabilities, and a recorded threat against a multimillionaire patriarch is an extreme liability. I personally walked into the downtown headquarters of the Atlanta Police Department 48 hours ago, I handed that unedited audio file directly to the Major Crimes Division. Valerie's entire body went completely limp. The blood rushed out of her head, leaving her face an ashen, ghostly gray. She realized the trap had been set long before she even walked into the ballroom tonight. She was not just facing social excommunication and financial ruin, she was facing a lengthy stint in a federal penitentiary. Before Valerie could attempt to crawl toward the service exit, the massive heavy oak doors at the front of the mansion swung violently open for the third and final time tonight. The remaining high society guests parted instantly, creating a clear path through the center of the room. Two local Atlanta detectives wearing dark suits and grim expressions marched purposefully onto the marble floor. Their heavy boots echoed sharply, breaking through the tense atmosphere. They bypassed the weeping Carlton and walked straight toward the marble pillar where Valerie was cowering. Valerie Dubois, the lead detective, stated, his voice commanding and completely devoid of any sympathy. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder." The words hit the ballroom like a physical shockwave. Valerie let out a blood-curdling scream that tore through her throat. As the second detective reached down to pull her up by her arms, she began to thrash violently, kicking her bare feet against the polished marble, fighting like a feral cat. "Do not touch me," Valerie screeched, spitting wildly, as the detectives forcefully spun her around and slammed her wrists together. "You cannot arrest me. I am a prominent socialite. I sit on the board of the Botanical Gardens." The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around her wrists echoed loudly, silencing her pathetic list of high society credentials. The detectives did not care about her country club status or her expensive ruined dress. They yanked her to her feet, dragging her roughly toward the front doors. Valerie realized it was completely over. The luxurious life she had stolen to build was gone forever. She whipped her head around, looking desperately at the pathetic man crying on the floor. "Carlton, do something!" Valerie shrieked, her voice raw with unadulterated venom. "Call a judge, call your lawyer. Do not let them drag me out of here. You useless, miserable failure. I wasted a decade of my life pretending to love you, and you cannot even protect me." Carlton just buried his face in his hands, weeping harder. Valerie thrashed against the detectives, kicking the air as they hauled her through the grand foyer. "You are nothing but a broke, pathetic old man." Carlton, Valerie screamed, her curses echoing down the hallway as the detectives dragged her out into the humid Atlanta night. "I hope you rot in the streets." The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind them, cutting off her final frantic scream. The flashing blue and red police lights reflected through the stained glass windows, casting an eerie, spinning glow over the utterly silent ballroom. Valerie Dubois, the woman who had terrorized me. My entire life was gone, hauled away in handcuffs in front of the elite society she worshipped. The story illustrates that true power is found in substance, not status. Aaliyah's father and his circle were obsessed with the appearance of wealth and prestige, performing success, rather than building anything real. By contrast, Aaliyah focused on her integrity and hard work. When the pressure mounted, the fake empire collapsed because it lacked a solid foundation. The most valuable lesson is to never compromise your principles for the approval of those who only value what you can do for them. Real success is built quietly, ensuring your own foundation is unbreakable before you ever face the storm. If you enjoy stories about justice and turning the tables on deception, subscribe for more updates.